Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this program at the Wilson Museum located in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation and their Wabanaki relations. We are so excited to be doing this program tonight in partnership with Casting Historical Society and are thrilled to have Jules here to share her knowledge and expertise. Before I hand it over to Jules, I'd like to let you know of an upcoming program that we're excited about. It'll be on Saturday, April 18th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. It's going to be a waffle bar and coffee house that's in partnership this year with the Casting Green Up Cleanup event. So that'll be really fun. You can come get waffles, and then if you'd like, which we're encouraging, to grab a trash bag and head out in town and help clean up the town. So more information on that is coming. Right now we have a placeholder for the waffle bar on our website, but the information about this new partnership will be added shortly. So that's very exciting. And it's in partnership with the Casting Rec Committee, the Casting Action Group, the Casting Garden Club, and also a little bit in partnership with Maine Maritime Academy's Maple Syrup Club, hopefully. So lots of partnerships going around. We're very excited for this new collaboration. I wanted to let you know that this program is being recorded and will hopefully be added to our YouTube channel so you can refer back to it or share it with a friend who didn't get to come tonight. And for our in-person audience, we would love for you to sign up or to sign in on our sheet back there on the little table, because as a nonprofit, it helps us show our community impact, knowing how many people and who came to our programs. And if you're not already, you can sign up for our e-newsletter, and there's a donation box if you'd like to make a donation. Okay, that's what I have for tonight. Now I will pass it over to Jules. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Haley. And thank you all for people who came in person who are in front of me now. And thank you so much everyone online for coming. I think we have upwards of 20 people online, which is very exciting. I didn't know what to expect for the audience for this. So thank you so much for coming. And I hope that I will answer some of your questions today. And if I don't answer them in the course of the talk, we do have a Q&A section at the end. So be thinking of things if I don't cover them. So I'm going to talk about preserving your family archive. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sort of idea of what you're in for here. So just going to do a little introduction of who I am and who I'm here on behalf of, which is the Casting Historical Society. I'm going to tell you what we kind of do in brief. And a disclaimer, which is basically just saying that I'm not a conservator, I'm an archivist, which are similar, but not exactly the same thing. And then I'm going to just talk about like really general tips for looking after your archives and photographic collections that kind of apply to everything. And then we're going to do like a little more of a deep dive into some of the ways you can care for photographs and some of the issues you might encounter with those, just because they're a more specific medium. And a lot of people have photos, obviously. That's probably one of the more common collection items. And also I'm going to touch briefly on multimedia, which includes like audiovisual materials, because a lot of people have those too. I'm not an expert in that, but we will briefly touch on that and look at some of the issues that you might encounter there and some of the best practices. I'm going to look at damage control, which is something that you may or may not need to worry about depending on the circumstances of your family archive and where it is, whether it's in an attic or basement, what's happening to it, what has happened to it in the past, things like that. If there's any issues there. And again, very briefly touching on professional conservation options and like potential vendors and things like that. I'm not going to necessarily list vendors, but I'll give you some ways to find vendors for conservation. And then a little bit about digitization too, because that's a very timely topic that a lot of people ask about. And then a space for questions at the end. So who am I? I am Jules. Haley kind of introduced me. But among other things, I have a library science degree with a concentration in archives, and that's from Simmons University in Boston, which is one of the big archive schools in the US, and library schools. But archives is a sort of subset of that in the US. And I'm currently the collections manager at the Casting Historical Society. So I look after the collections there. Those include archives and objects. So I kind of do a little bit of everything, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm really going to be focusing on my role as an archivist and our archival and photographic collections, because that's most likely what you guys are going to have in your home archive too. In terms of what our mission statement is at the Castine Historical Society, it is verbatim, we make Castine history accessible, relevant, and inspiring to all. So that's literally what we are trying to do out in the world. And we accomplish this through answering research and reference inquiries in person and by phone and email. We provide free public access to materials in our reading room. That includes maintaining an online public catalog. And then we're probably most famous for rotating and permanent public exhibits. That's kind of what we're more known for. And we also work with local schools a little bit. We do free historical walking tours in the season. We do other educational programming like public lecture series, things like that. A lot of you guys already know this, but like people from Castine already know this. Some people, I think, attending are not from Castine, so I just want to let you know who we are. And our collections that I look after are a big piece of how we provide these offerings. They're usually kind of a piece of it. They include reference material like books and a lot of vertical files that have photocopied articles and things in them. It's pretty typical for historical society. So people can come and research those. But we also have 2 vaults worth of original materials, so like one-off materials. One of them is dedicated entirely to archival and photographic collections. So we have quite a lot of those collections. And those include things like kind of what you'd expect, but like paper collections, which include letters, diaries, ledgers, financial and legal records, civic records. We got the town of Castine records there, actually. We have maps and charts. We've got certificates, posters, ephemera, like ads and flyers, artwork, print photographs, and a lot of transparent negatives and film, older cased photographs, which are an interesting thing that you may or may not have at home. Some people do. And we also have a little bit of multimedia and audiovisual collections, although not a ton, which is okay with me because I'm not an expert in those. And as an archivist, my job is primarily to organize information and make it easier for researchers, which includes any of you at this talk. Any member of the public is a researcher, in our opinion, and are welcome. Makes it easier for you to find and look at, hopefully. That's really what we're here for. And the disclaimer part of this is that I am not actually a conservator. And sometimes people mix up these roles in the popular imagination, probably because of the whole white glove thing, which is actually a false stereotype because archivists don't really wear gloves except when we're handling photo collections. Nowadays, I think it used to be more of a thing, but it's less encouraged now, despite what you see in the movies where they still probably do. But archivist and conservator are almost always separate roles. So a conservator's job is actually to like repair things. And that can include safely cleaning archival materials, as well as like more obvious physical repair. They do really amazing repair of paper and things like that. They also do bookbinding and things like that quite frequently, depending on how their laboratories are set up. So it's quite a cool job. I am sometimes jealous of them, but I didn't want to get a chemistry degree because I'm bad at math, and so I didn't become a conservator. But they're very cool people and I like them a lot. But anyway, with that caveat in mind, it is true that in the course of my work, I need to be aware of some basic preservation and conservation practices because of what I do when I'm organizing our collections. So I have picked up like a number of best practices and tips and tricks. So I can tell you what we do at the Historical Society, and I can give you similar advice as it's going to apply to your home archive. This talk is also an amalgamation of a bunch of professional advice that I found online from sites like the US National Archives and the Smithsonian, the American Institute of Conservation, the Library of Congress, and NEDCC, who I will be talking more about. That's the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is one of the biggest conservation services on the East Coast, and also the external conservation company that we consult with the most at CHS. Advances, yes. Okay, so these are our beautiful storage vault. Well, it is our upper storage vault, which is the archive storage vault. We are very lucky at the Historical Society to have fireproof and climate-controlled storage, which is great in the case also of like a tornado or a hurricane or a nuclear fallout. It's probably one of the safest places to be on the peninsula, which is really great. But this kind of resource is not typical for a town level historical society. It's really not even typical for most town level historical societies to have full-time staff. But we are special because we were given a substantial monetary bequest in 2008 that allowed us to build these amazing storage areas and also hire full-time professional staff, which is really nice. And that's what I have a job. So I'm very grateful for that. And having these amazing storage spaces means that I don't have to worry much about climate control beyond checking our HVAC system and the thermostat to make sure that it's working properly. And sadly, this probably won't apply to your home archive, but there are things you can do to help regulate your own environment, and I will talk about that in a second. Oh yeah, then this is just a photo of a conservator's studio to show you the contrast there. I'm not sure where this photo is from. I should have double checked, but it's a lot of conservators in one place. I think it's probably an academic institution or like a large library or museum. It's somewhere big. It's more typical to have like no conservator or just a single one. I worked at a county record office in the UK that had a staff of around 20 and they had one conservator. So that's more like a typical ratio. So for us who has zero, if we have any like serious conservation or repair work, we have to send it off site. And you can see in the picture, they have like specialized equipment like paper presses and tools of various types like brushes and things like that. They all look very happy in this picture because being a conservator is very cool, but so is being an archivist, and we are fun too. So onto the kind of general tip section. I'm going to talk about like general rules that you can apply to all the records you might have. So what kind of things might you have? These are just some examples of things that people donate to us. And so things that we are familiar with from people's homes. And there is a pretty broad spectrum, but there are things that kind of rise to the top as like more typical items. A lot of that's paper media, letters, postcards, certificates, journals, scrapbooks, which got mentioned in the preamble, newspapers and clippings, financial and legal records, maps, two-dimensional artwork, manuscripts, and sometimes published materials, print photographs. That includes modern print photographs, but also older print photograph media like albumen prints, cabinet cards, carte de visites. Those are fancy words for various types of older, usually 19th century photographic media. And entire photograph albums also are fairly common. Photographic transparencies also, so negatives, which can be celluloid, or glass plate negatives, which are really cool, usually really high quality. And celluloid color film, like 35mm slides, which are very common. And most excitingly of all, there's the really early photographic media, which are usually cased photographs like daguerreotypes and ambrotypes and tintypes. And some of you are probably familiar with those. It's kind of like a typical Civil War era type photograph, where there's like that portrait of Emily Dickinson, which I think is a daguerreotype. And they're called cased photographs because they're literally in little cases to protect them from the light. And then last but not least, multimedia, audiovisual of various kinds. That's like tape cassettes, VHS, CDs, DVDs. So in terms of things you can do right away for the good of your home archive, there's like the single best thing you can do, which is controlling your environment. And this is kind of getting to the heart of the title of this talk, which is get the things out of the attic. And it's worth saying, like, all collections will deteriorate over time, so don't beat yourself up about it too much. But you can make small changes in the way you store things and handle them, and that will have a big impact on the lifespan of the materials. The best defense is a good offense. It's kind of how I think of it. So the best protection for books, papers, photographs, prints, et cetera, is to have a cool, dry, stable environment with good air circulation and limited light exposure. Those are all really important. And temperature and humidity come into that a lot. So this is where, obviously, where we are very lucky at the Historical Society and where my job is going to be easier than yours because we have climate controlled vaults. But you just have to do your best with what you have, and that is fine. So the thing to keep in mind, the basics are that a good target temperature is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And a good relative humidity is going to be under 55% humidity. And how do you know what your humidity is? Maybe you have a fancy thermostat that tells you. You can buy data readers like the one pictured in this slide, which, by the way, the numbers on that are not within the correct ranges, so ignore those. But I just wanted to show you what one of them looks like. They're relatively cheap. If you want to be very professional about it, you can get one of those. And the good news is that in your actual living space in your home, it's actually going to tend to stay like roughly within those ranges just because of the need for human habitation. But the places that usually aren't in those ranges are the attic and basement. And that is unfortunately where most people, like, maybe not most, but many people tend to store their archival materials, especially if they're unsorted or whatever, and they haven't touched them in decades. That tends to be where they end up. And that is also sometimes where they have been when they get donated to us. And sometimes they're in a mixed state of preservation. So both of those spaces, like, obviously they tend to experience more extreme temperatures, usually poor airflow, and moisture problems. And so the best thing you can do, really, if you do have stuff in either of those areas, is to take them out and put it in a more controlled area. And the other final thing I'll say about that is that consistency is important in itself, because extreme shifts in temperature and humidity can create problematic things like curling and warping of records and photographs. Like, it literally will warp your paper, and like warp paper that has emulsion on it with your photos. And so it can be quite damaging to just have big up and down extremes like that. So you want to create a stable environment. And again, this will just be helped by moving things out of those problem areas if they are in there. So a little bit more about kind of minimizing risks and mitigating environmental risks. Again, some of this is very basic common sense, but I think it's still worth mentioning. You've taken a really important first step by getting the stuff out of your basement or attic. Good job. But once you have relocated the records in your home, it's a good idea to kind of look around the area and go through a little bit of a mental checklist. So just going through some stuff and asking yourself basic questions like, is there a water source nearby? Are there radiators or heating vents or fireplaces or other heat sources that are going to create localized high temperatures? Is there anything on the floor above that could cause problems, like pipes or whatever? That kind of goes into the water source thing, but or anything else. Is there a lot of sunlight coming into the room? Because that can be an issue. Does the room have a lot of fluorescent lighting? Most of that is hopefully going to be mitigated by putting things in a box, which I'll talk about later. But nonetheless, make sure that that is something that you're keeping in mind. And then also, definitely, is there evidence of mice or insects or anything like that? Because that is something you do not want to be nibbling on your records. And if any of those things are true, what can you do to minimize that risk? So just, basic advice, but important to note. And so the next most important thing after that climate control stuff is storage and housing of the records. This is one of the things that we do all the time at the Historical Society, but you might not be as familiar with it. And so housing items in storage enclosures provides another layer of protection from like everything, temperature and humidity fluctuations, from light, obviously, from pests, hopefully, you name it, basically. And enclosures also provide structural support. So they provide the contents, they protect the contents from tears, from breaks or slumping or other distortions, and they reduce damage from airborne pollutants. So we usually use a combination of preservation quality paper enclosures, which is just a fancy way of saying boxes and folders, basically. Like the image on the left is a good example. That's a pretty typical kind of setup that we would have for a larger collection. And actually the one on the right too, honestly, for a slightly smaller collection. And chemically stable plastic enclosures are also something we use a lot. And both of those things are suitable for like a wide variety of materials. So paper enclosures like boxes and folders, everything on this page that's pictured, you can buy those from archival suppliers. There is I haven't even mentioned this yet, but there is a resource page at the end of this presentation that I'm gonna also link to. It's on the Wilson's website, and it's actually on the event page for this event, I believe, and you can actually go there and see the links as well. So that it will be an important resource for many things that I'm going to talk about later too. including it has links to the archival equipment suppliers that will have all of these materials, many of which you can actually also buy like on, Amazon.com or like office supply places. But if you do go to the archival supply source, they're gonna tend to be they're going to conform to the standards that I'm about to talk about, but they're more likely that they're going to conform to those standards. So it's maybe like a little bit more of a safe bet to order them from these places. Two of the big examples are Gaylord Archival, which is what we mostly use. And there's another one called Hollinger that is quite frequently used by archives. And they're on the list. Yeah, and the second option, getting them from like I already said that, yeah. The second option, getting them from an office supply store or whatever, it might be cheaper, but you need to be more careful about ensuring that it's the right kind of material. And the right kind of material is going to be acid-free, what they call acid-free, and lignin-free, which is kind of the same thing. Acid is what it sounds like. It's corrosive material in paper, and it eats away at the original item, but it also often eats away at the items that are touching it, which is fun. And that's the really scary thing about acidification, is it can destroy things around it too. And lignin is the primary agent of acidification. So it's a corrosive component in some paper that can cause like brittleness and discoloration. A great example of this is newsprint, which you have probably seen, old newsprint that's like fading to yellow and becoming brittle. That's because it has lignin in it and it's acidifying. So you don't want that. So make sure you're looking for an acid-free label on any box or folder that you're purchasing. And usually if you just like search for that, even if you're looking at a generic supplier, you can find things that are acid-free. And then the other thing is these plastic enclosures. Lots of different varieties of these. The plastic, oh God, even I kind of get a little dizzy looking at all the different types of plastic. There's a lot of big words here like polyethylene and polypropylene, and I'm just gonna lay them on you right now. But there are some rules you can follow. Basically, anything that starts with poly tends to be good, and other things tend to be bad. But I will go through it in a little more detail. But basically, plastic enclosures are great for instances where it's important that you want to see an item, and you also maybe want to handle it a lot, but you don't want to damage it with your handling. There are bad plastics that you do not want to use. Those are things like acetates, which can warp, and also polyvinyl chloride, which is more commonly known as PVC, because that has like harmful volatile compounds in it. Again, not a chemist. I don't know exactly what all this means, but I know that they're bad. And those can affect your records. So you don't want that touching your records. But the safe options are preservation grade polyester. Again, it starts with poly, so you know it's okay. That is often sold under the brand name Mylar or Melanex. And that is like the kind of industry standard best one that you can use. And then there's also polyethylene or polypropylene. They're also inert and safe for your items. We use those a lot actually at the Historical Society because they tend to be a little cheaper than the Mylar. So like for our photo collections, we sleeve basically all of our photos individually, and we tend to use those because we are using so much of it, and it's a little bit cheaper, but it's still totally fine for the photos. And then in addition to all this crazy amounts of plastic things that you have to remember, there is one really helpful thing that you can also look for when you're purchasing any of these materials, and that is the PAT label, P-A-T, which stands for Photographic Activity Test. And that label, if you see that label on something, it guarantees that the plastic enclosure will not react chemically with photographs or other records. And I got a picture of that, what that looks like on the next slide there. And if you're ordering from an official supplier like Gaylord or Hollinger, you probably don't even have to worry about this. I mean, they're probably not going to have things that aren't passing PAT on there. But if you're getting them elsewhere, it's a helpful thing to be able to refer to this label. And just some other generic storage tips for you and other things you might encounter. Something quite common, especially if you have family letters, which are a very, very awesome thing to have. But they can come with some problems, like if they are still in their envelopes, which is not necessarily terrible, but we don't love it. It's better to store them in folders rather than envelopes for a few different reasons, basically to reduce damage from handling. And you also don't know that the envelope is acid free, so it's kind of good not to have it touching the letter. Ideally, removing the letters from their envelopes and putting them in individual folders, which you can then label with information like the sender recipient date, is the best thing. That's what we do. You can retain the envelope with the letter, but consider folding it separately or putting it in a plastic sleeve or something like that, just so they're not touching. A different scenario that you might encounter is folded or rolled materials. That's quite common, especially for larger things. This is a tricky one in a way. Folding or rolling materials can be a conservation concern, especially the folding, just because it creates breaks in the paper, especially if you're unfolding it and refolding it. That's going to, potentially cause breaks. If possible, papers should be flattened for storage. Sometimes that's not practical if they're very large, but just do the best you can. That's what we try to do. I will talk more about how to do that in a later slide. Framed items are another kind of can of worms, because framing sounds like it's going to be protective, and it kind of is. But sometimes there is acid in framing materials, especially in older ones. We see a lot of that. Sometimes I've unframed something at CHS, and you can actually see a border of acid around the artwork or whatever where the frame materials have been touching it, and that's not good. So you might want to reframe it if you can, depending what it is and how valuable it is. Just make sure that when you are reframing it, whatever materials you're using are preservation quality. Ideally, also use UV filtering glass or acrylic, which reduces light damage to the item. If the item, usually if something is in a frame, it is probably kind of valuable, or like a family artwork or something. So, those are things to consider. There is a link on the resource sheet that's all about choosing a good frame. So you can consult that in more detail too. And then, oh gosh, so news clippings. This is a fun one. It's like our favorite thing. Probably the favorite thing of every historical society is news clippings. Hopefully you can detect the sarcasm. They are the worst. Newsprint is one of the most highly corrosive materials that we have in the archives, probably the highest. And the best thing you can do really with newsprint is just to photocopy it onto acid-free paper of any kind. And what you do with the originals is up to you. You can keep them if you really want to. You can store them separately, but just be sure you place a sheet of interleaving paper between them and the copy to reduce the acid migration. Or you can also just throw the originals away if the original is not that important to you. If it's really just the information that you want, you can just keep the photocopy. It depends on the situation. And then the last kind of special case is something we do a lot as well. Well, that's something I do a lot when I'm processing archival collections, which is removing fasteners, which just refers to paper clips and staples, which are like a very common thing in a lot of the collections we process. And they're bad because they're usually made of metal, and that usually does create rust, especially if there's humidity. And you'll get rust and corrosion on a lot of the paper, which is not ideal. And you may or may not have this issue with your family archive, depending on what kind of materials you have. But if you do, there are tools you can use to remove tons of staples and paper clips. Paper clips are kind of easier. You can usually just pull them off. But with staples, that little picture on the right there, the little metal spatulas, those are what we use, just to kind of slide them under the back of the staple and take it off. And they're my personal favorite tool. There are probably a couple other tools you can use to do that, but that's the one that I like the most. This is like a totally random one, but we do get questions about this occasionally. Eliminating odors in books, because sometimes books have mildew in them and stuff, and it's gross, and people don't like the way they smell, especially if you're moving stuff from like your basement into your home and it smells gross. Hopefully there's no active mold. I will talk about active mold later, but this is, if it's just, kind of a dank smell, there are things you can do for that too. I haven't really personally used this, but I just read about it for this talk. There's something called microchamber interleaving paper that is recommended by various different places. Has a mineral in it called zeolite, and apparently they're very effective in removing odors. You literally just put the paper, you sort of interleave the paper like every 20 pages in a volume, and it will deodorize it. You can get it from a number of vendors. I looked on Amazon. You can get it on Amazon and other places. And then the other advice there is you close the book and set it aside for a month to let it like totally deodorize. And you might have to repeat the process if it's really bad, but that's how you do that. So it's good to know. Moving on to photos. So they're a little bit of a special case. This is the one time that I will tell you you should wear gloves for sure, because your finger oils will destroy photographic emulsion in a way that they're just more dangerous to photos than they are to paper for whatever reason. And that also applies actually not just to print photographs, but also to transparencies like slides and negatives. So any photographic material at all, ideally you are going to want to wear gloves. It can be any type of gloves technically. I mean, the main thing is just you don't want to get your finger oils on them. So you can use latex, you can use cotton. We tend to use cotton, but that's because we already have a lot of it. In terms of like how you hold the photo, that's a good illustration of how to do it on the left there. Support it underneath with your hand and hold it by its edges. Just best practice, you know. Do I do that every time I handle a photo? Probably not, but I mostly try. It's just one of those professional best practice things. In terms of storage for photos, there are a lot of different options. The most classic one is a photo album. That's obviously what people did for like a century. And you can still do that. It's fine. It's a pretty solid storage method for photographic prints, especially snapshots and heirloom photos. You can safely store them. You can organize them pretty well in albums. If you want to look at them a whole lot, that's a really good medium for being able to flip through and look at them without inflicting a bunch of damage. Just be sure to choose, if you are choosing a ready-made album, make sure to get one that is acid-free and has preservation quality. If it does have plastic in it, that it has preservation quality plastic. Again, polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene, all are poly friends. And ideally make sure they pass the PAT test, which is, those are the same thing basically. And also important to note, when you are adding photos to an album, don't glue or tape them in. That is what our ancestors did when they were making photo albums, and we hate that because it's really bad for both the photos and the paper. A way to get around that, if you do need to, if they don't have like a dedicated plastic sleeve or something in the album, you can use photo corners or mounting corners, which they're going to avoid the use of tape and glue. So those are a good alternative. Another solid choice for storing your photo collections is in binders, which is kind of a similar idea to the albums. When I say binders, I mean like literally 3-ring binders. That's actually what we mostly use at CHS, especially for our sort of post-1950 photographs. And that usually entails like plastic pocket pages where you can slide the photo in and then put them in the binder. And that is just, it's a similar kind of solution to an album. It's just a more kind of rough and ready solution, I guess. Another option is literally just storing them in acid-free boxes, like in the picture there. And we do that as well, actually. For whatever reason, we mostly do that for our pre-1950 photographs. They're usually in boxes like that. We sleeve them individually in polyethylene, and then we put them in boxes. And there are standard size boxes available for like basically any photographic standard size you can think of, like going all the way back to the 19th century. Most of those are probably going to be on like the Gaylord and Hollinger type sites. Yeah, that's what we do. Ideally, if you're putting them in boxes, you also want to enclose them in the plastic sleeve. If you don't feel that's necessary, that's obviously fine. It's just it's like an extra layer of protection, especially if you're frequently handling the photo. I think that's probably the main concern there. But admittedly, the cost of those plastic sleeves can add up, and so that's a potential consideration. So just do whatever works for you, really. Some other potential considerations with the photo stuff. The most important thing actually overall, really, is to make sure that you are labeling your photos. That is like hugely important, and it's weirdly not something that everyone thinks of to do. I mean, myself included. Because unlike archival documents, unlabeled photos are just uniquely vulnerable to information loss. And all it takes is one generation to forget who a person is or what event is depicted. So please label your photos. Label them with the kind of classic who, what, where, when type of information. That is going to help your own family members and your heirs. It's also going to help people like me if you donate them to a historical society, because otherwise we are not going to be able to probably track down the identity of a lot of the people or the events depicted in the photos unless there's some really big clue in the photo itself. So labeling is very important. Again, obvious, but like something that not everyone does, maybe as much as they should. So it is important to note. That's a good question. There's a lot of good archival ink pens you can buy, and just basically look for archival ink, I would say. Sorry, Abby asked what kind of thing to use to label them. Depending on the type of photo, you can even write in pencil on the back of some of them, depending on the type of backing. That's something that I haven't actually mentioned explicitly in this talk, but if you can write in pencil on stuff, we always use pencil. If you must use pen, try to use something with archival ink in it, basically, is the kind of rule. And yes, that's another good one. Yeah, Haley said use first names and last names, not just like this is a picture of my dad, because in a century people aren't going to know who wrote that, so they're not going to know who your dad is. And like, so put like the first name and the last name. Yeah, that's a very good point. That is also really good to do. Thank you. And another issue that comes up frequently is that you might have an old photo album where the photos are pasted onto acidified paper, which is always fun. We have that a lot at the Historical Society. It's just one of those things that they love to do back in the day. Honestly, that might be one of these cases where you just want to leave it. If the photos don't seem to be in particular danger, then you can just leave it, and that's okay. It's probably not a huge problem. If it is a huge problem and it's not something you feel you can tackle yourself, maybe consult a professional conservator, and I'll talk more about how to do that. But if you must do it yourself, you can technically like cut out the photos. You can cut around them, and then sleeve them individually or put them in an album, a fresh album that you've created or whatever. That's only going to be possible if there are no photographs on the other side of the page. So use your common sense there. Sometimes the adhesive holding the photographs is going to be completely dried out, in which case you can like slide a little card or something behind the photo to help release it. That's one option. If you can't release the photos without causing damage, or if the album itself is worth preserving just as an object, and it's probably time to consult a photograph conservator. And there's links to that in the resource section. Briefly, cased photographs. I don't know if anyone has these in their family collections. They're really neat, but unfortunately, they're also kind of a conservation nightmare, especially if anything goes wrong with them. We have a fairly large collection of them at the Historical Society. We just put them in individual plastic sleeves and then put those in a box. The most important thing with the cased photographs is to avoid light exposure. By the way, the cased photographs are these guys. You haven't seen them before, that's what they look like. If the cases are busted or ragged or like missing their lids, there are professional repair options available for those. They might not be very cheap. They're just one of those kind of fiddly archival items, unfortunately. If the glass plate or the components inside are dirty or mildewy, which does unfortunately happen kind of frequently with these, that's not really something you want to attempt to repair yourself. Pretty much any serious issue with these cased photos is going to require a professional conservator. The emulsion is just really unstable or delicate, I guess. And you probably will accidentally destroy it if you try to do a DIY cleanup job on it. So just don't, would be my advice, unfortunately. Briefly, films or negatives, or probably most commonly 35mm slides if you have these kind of things. The same basic storage rules apply to these as apply to print photos. You just want to ensure that it's acid-free storage with no light exposure and PAT-tested plastics again. In terms of the actual storage options, there are a lot of custom options that exist, both boxes and sleeves. You can see everything that's depicted on that slide. You can store film and slides in plastic sleeves and 3-ring binders, again, similar to how you can do it with print photos, like the two on the right there. And on the top left, there's a custom slide box that you can order. It's a good example of one of those. Any of these solutions work. It's just whatever works best for your storage needs, really. There's a lot of options. Multimedia, my favorite. I'm not going to dwell super long on this because it's not my expertise, but there's some basic things you can kind of know about them. For one thing, multimedia or audiovisual can include a wide range of formats, discs, tapes, films, records, cylinders. And in terms of the storage and enclosures, it's kind of similar advice again. I mean, you want your containers for them to be chemically stable, and you want them to physically support the materials so that they fit the original media as closely as possible. Any film container should pass the PAT test again, photographic activity test, to ensure there's no damage from additives or glues or weird chemicals. Again, the polyethylene, polypropylene, polyester PAT tested stuff is what you want. That can extend to plastic zip bags or sleeves or bins. Those can all be, as long as they're made out of those materials, they're okay. And ideally, you don't want any weird coating agents on them. So try to get things that are simple plastics like that. Avoid acetate and PVC, like with everything else. And the original jewel cases for CDs and DVDs are fine. Those do not need to be replaced. Having said that, there are other issues with CDs and DVDs that you're going to want to consider, like this one, technological obsolescence. Or in layman's terms, I can't play this anymore, either because it's corrupted, which unfortunately does happen with those optical discs quite a lot, or because you literally don't have the right technology to play it anymore. You don't have something to emulate it. So certain types of media do have a shelf life, unfortunately, and that does include CDs and DVDs, probably most of all. I've heard different estimates of how bad their shelf life is, anything from like 5 years up to 10 to 20. In my experience, it's not as dire as 5 years. I think they tend to last longer than that, but regardless, we're talking decades rather than, centuries. And then there's other things that are maybe slightly better, but still do technically have a shelf life, like magnetic tape, and all your different types of film, like celluloid film, obviously, but also acetate and nitrate, which hopefully you don't have tons of. And if you do, you probably want to talk to Northeast Historic Film in Bucksport, because they know a lot better than I do how to deal with that. But anyway, because of this kind of shelf life of these things, one of the most important things you can do with your multimedia collections is to migrate your media. That's really like the number one thing here. And when I say migrated, I mean transform it to a different format. And that's usually nowadays going to mean digital. The playback machines, like I mentioned, VHS player or whatever, those are eventually going to become obsolete and no longer made, or practical to maintain. And that's another reason that really converting these things to a new format is what you want to do. So any conservation plan for these should include upgrading them to a digital format, probably digital. And that is going to entail a search for vendors who can do that for you. A quick internet search will reveal a range of providers that can do that. The official advice I found online is look for a provider that specializes in archival transfer of your specific original format. Library of Congress also says, avoid providers that outsource the reformatting work overseas. And I assume they say that because it could probably take like months for you to get your media back. I'm not sure, but anyway, that's what they say. So try to find a domestic one, I guess. So pivoting back to the more general collections, this is just some basic overview of damage control type stuff, which you might encounter. There's sort of simple things like dirt, tears, stains, discoloration, fading, old tape that's on things. And typically conservation work to address this kind of damage is going to be like time consuming and costly. So if the item has collector's value or the damage is minor or it's not frequently handled, you might just want to leave it as is, and that's fine. Focus on improving your overall storage conditions. There are, however, if you want to do DIY repair or cleaning on some of these, there are written resources you can consult, and they are in the resource guide that's provided. There's one called Surface Cleaning of Paper, which might be useful. There's also one called Repairing Paper Artifacts. They're both linked on the resource page. I mentioned that I was going to talk about flattening and unrolling paper, because I did say earlier that it's better to store paper flat rather than rolled or folded. But if you ever try to unroll a rolled paper, you know that that's really not that easy. So how do you actually do that? Well, there is written guidance on how to do that in the resource page, but basically it's a process of humidification. And there are ways to do that. You can actually humidify the paper flat, which is really handy. And we have done that a couple times at the Historical Society. Just a quick note on mold, which we do get asked about occasionally. Unfortunately, it's not a very uncommon issue for household archives, especially if things have been in basements or if there's been flooding or anything like that. Basically, the three things you want to avoid with mold, the three things that mold really likes is high temperature combined with high humidity and low air circulation. So that's what we don't want. So what you want to do is you want to isolate moldy records in a place that is cool, dry, and has a lot of air circulation. And don't return them to their original location until the conditions causing the mold growth are addressed. Another strategy that you can employ here is actually freezing your records, literally putting them in a freezer for 24 hours to kill any active mold. Once the materials are removed to a less hospitable environment, the mold will become loose and powdery, and the mold will turn dormant. Dormant doesn't mean dead, but it does mean that it's not actively growing, and that is good. At that point, you can actually brush it off the item, but ideally do this outside with respiratory protection, especially if you have allergy issues. Obviously, if you're having any negative health effects because of it, stop and do not proceed further. It's a disclaimer. It's probably time to consult a professional at that point. Because the mold is only dormant, it is going to remain on the record materials. It can be distributed throughout the space and onto other objects, and it will grow whenever environmental conditions are favorable again. So you do have to ensure that your environmental control is not going to cause that, and that it is within your required ranges as previously discussed, so that doesn't happen. So relative humidity between 40 to 65%, temperature around 70 Fahrenheit. And don't forget to check your items regularly to make sure that the mold isn't actively growing. That's just a picture of some moldy books in a freezer, which is something we have done once or twice, although ours were not that gross, fortunately. And then bugs are another really gross conservation issue. I just realized that I've gone on and I need to speed this up a little bit, sorry. So I'm gonna go through this quite quickly, but anyway, there are a lot of different types of paper pests. Fumigation is not necessarily recommended if you find them in your records. Should probably be avoided. Instead, just try to address the source of the infestation, seal all possible entry points, remove or seal up pest lures such as food or trash, keep temperature and relative humidity low. You're sensing a theme here probably, and keep the area clean and dust-free. One thing that's worth noting is that pests found in these records are usually the types that are attracted to damp conditions, so they kind of go along with the mold thing. If the infestation is widespread, there is probably excess moisture present somewhere. So if you can locate that and eliminate that and get rid of the high humidity, that should help in theory. So really, it's all about maintaining good environmental conditions. There's literally a bug flying around in here as I'm talking about. So professional options for conservation, because you may get to that point. There are a few scenarios when you should definitely go professional. Rolled items that you can't unroll without tearing, original documents that are stuck to each other. If there's bad mold growth on original documents that you can't mitigate yourself, a document that is in many different pieces, and books with damaged bindings are reasons that you should seek professional help. And the best way to find a conservator currently is to look at the American Institute for Conservation Find a Professional page, and that again is linked on the resource page. Digitization, very popular issue right now. I do want to touch on it. It's something we get asked about a lot. And I just want to talk about sort of the philosophy of digitization for a second. Namely, why do you want to digitize your records? And should you? There are a few reasons why it would be a good idea to do it. Ease of access is definitely one of them, and findability, especially if you're talking about something like 35 millimeter slides where it's really hard to view them without a digital version. It also prevents use, wear, and damage to the original material if you have if you can just consult digital files. And you might think that it would be good for long-term preservation, but that's only true if you're really good at backing up your data, which we are not always good at. So it's not actually necessarily a compelling reason to digitize things. There's a whole science of how to have a good lifespan for your digital data called digital preservation, but I'm not going to go into that because it's too long and complicated. But one thing I will say is just try to name and store your digital files in such a way that you can easily find and retrieve them. I know it sounds obvious, but people are really bad at it, including myself. So that is just something you want to keep in mind.
There
are phone apps that can help you with this.
Sorry, I gotta ask you to switch mics. I gave you the one in charge.
Okay.
You got it?
Yeah, that's fine. Perfect. Oh yeah, phone apps. There are phone apps that you can use for digitizing your own archives, such as PhotoScan by Google Photos, which I haven't used, but apparently it's good. Again, it's on the resources page. And another option is the flatbed scanner or a photocopier. Just avoid scanners that require paper to be fed through an automatic feed slot because they can be damaged. Use your best judgment. Very fragile materials should probably not be scanned on a scanner, including books or booklets that have fragile spines. Just make sure the original fits completely on the surface, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, just use your common sense there. For transparencies like celluloid negatives and slides, you can invest in a slide scanner, which are a couple of versions are pictured there. Some of them are not too heinously expensive. If you already have a tabletop scanner, there are slide scanning inserts that you can use on those sometimes as well. That's actually what we do. But if you have like hundreds and hundreds of slides, you might want to just outsource their digitization to a professional. It's just going to be a calculation based on cost quote of how effective that's going to be for your personal situation, really. For cased photographs, if anyone has those, the daguerreotype, ambrotype stuff, digitization is like impossible, basically. And I would say you're probably just going to have to do a professional digitization vendor for that. NEDCC, who I thought I was going to talk about more, but I actually haven't. Northeast Document Conservation Center, they are linked many times on the resource page. They will actually do digitization of your cased photographs, and they have done that for us in the past, and they came out really well. Professional options in general are a good solution if you don't feel that you can safely digitize your records, or if there are just like too many of them, like usually in the case of 35 millimeter slides, if you have a ton of those. And that is pretty much all from me before I take questions. This is a preview of the resource page, which is again linked on the Wilson's event page. So you can look at that at any point. And it includes specific conservation scenarios, a lot of the NEDCC things that you see up there, or specific problems that you might have, or specific issues. And then there's the Find a Professional page from the Institute for Conservation, which is how you find someone to actually help. And then links to some of the archival supply companies up at the top there, which is probably going to be the most universally helpful thing on there. Yeah, that is all for me. Finally, I didn't go too long. I kind of did. Phew, by 2 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can go over a little bit of that for questions though. So yeah. Does anyone have any questions online or in person? Good, excellent. I hope people got enough out of it. And if there's any follow-up questions, my email's up there. Feel free, obviously, to get in touch.